My name is Bruno Moreland and I teach AP African American Studies. And in this series, I'm going to go over all the required sources in the AP African American Studies curriculum. And today we're looking at topic 2.3, Capture and Impact of the Slave Trade on African Societies. There's two required sources in this topic, and they're both written documents. The first one is a poem by Phillis Wheatley, a woman who was enslaved in the United States and then later gained her freedom. And the other one is by a man named Olaudah Equiano, who wrote the first slave narrative, recounting what his experience was like being captured in Africa, then sent to the United States as an enslaved person, and ultimately gaining his freedom. So we'll start with Phillis Wheatley. She was born in 1753 in Africa and was enslaved as a young child. In 1761, she was enslaved by the Wheatley family in Boston. They taught her how to read and write. As a result of that education, she took to writing poetry, and by 1767, she published her first poem in a local newspaper. In 1773, her and the Wheatleys traveled to London, where she became the first Black woman to ever have a book of poetry published. That book is titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. Shortly after the publication of her book, she's freed and gains worldwide acclaim for her published book of poems. She returns to the United States, marries, but unfortunately in 1784, she dies mostly in poverty. Though she wasn't forgotten by her contemporaries, and in 1785 is actually mentioned by Thomas Jefferson in his Notes on the State of Virginia, albeit in a negative way. The poem of hers, which we're looking at today, is titled On Being Brought from Africa to America. It's a short poem, so I'll read it in its entirety here. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." So one of the unique things that you see from this poem is that at this point in her life, Wheatley is very much shaped by her Christian conversion. In the very first line of the poem, she describes Africa as a pagan land. In this context, it's describing a land full of people that praise or worship false gods. Though for the rest of the poem, she's trying to dispel the notions of racism that people may have against people that look like her or have black skin. She tries to reiterate that they are not evil or damned just because of the color of their skin, but instead have the ability to convert to Christianity just like any other human soul. The second excerpt that comes from Olaudah Equiano from his book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, was published in 1789. That's when he was 44 years old. He was born in 1745, and at 11 he was kidnapped along with his sister and put into slavery. Him and his sister were enslaved by various indigenous slavers, and eventually they were sold to the coast to be put through the Middle Passage and landed in Barbados. Ultimately, a lieutenant in the British Royal Navy in Virginia buys him and promises his freedom. The lieutenant goes back on his word, but by 1766, Equiano had amassed about 40 British pounds to purchase his own freedom as a result of doing side jobs. He settles in London and publishes his narrative in 1789 with the help of British Anti-Slavery Society. He died in 1797, but the legacy of his narrative is that it was instrumental in helping the British abolish slavery by swaying most of the British public against the institution and a formal abolition in 1807. The excerpt that the College Board points us to is from chapter 2 of his narrative, and it describes the experience of arriving on the coast and seeing the slave ship which he's going to be put in. His first impressions deal with the size of the ship. He had never seen something that large in his life before. And also, he's fearful of the white sailors, never having seen anyone with white skin before or with long hair as the sailors had in that instance. Here's what he says. "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them all to have exchanged my condition with that of the meanest slave in my own country. He goes on to detail the terrible conditions that were on board, his first experience of going below deck and smelling the terrible smells that came from below. He learned that his refusal to eat would later result in punishment, and that nettings had been put up around the slave ship to prevent any enslaved person from jumping overboard and committing suicide. Here's what he says. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I have never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across. I think the windlass, and I tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced any of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared the element the first time I saw it. Yet nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. So Equiano spent some time aboard the slave ship until it was finally full with its human cargo, and when it finally reached its limit, it set off across the Atlantic. At that point, he had to continue to live underneath the ship, was tied with chains to other enslaved people below deck, and he describes the experience in this way. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspiration so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of the purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains now become insupportable and the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable. Putting this personal account of what it was like to undergo the Middle Passage with the numbers that we saw in the previous video of the nearly 13 million people that survived the Middle Passage should help you understand the magnitude of the experiences that people had to undergo. Luckily, Equiano survived to tell his story, but not all were so lucky. So those are the 2 sources for this unit's topic. I'm really curious to hear what you think of them. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.